are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. Contention 1, European stability. Putin won't stop at Crimea. Professor George Washington University states in May 2014, President Vladimir Putin has an expansionist agenda, bringing Russian speakers into the Russian Federation, establishing a sphere of influence, and maintaining a state of confrontation with the West. As part of this policy, Moscow has already seized generous slices of Georgia and Azerbaijan. Ian Brzezinski of the Atlantic Council predicts in March 2014, the absence of a firm Western response will only encourage Putin to act aggressively again, be it to make another attempt to seize Georgia, expand Russia's occupation of Moldova, or grab other areas that were once part of the Soviet Union. Fortunately, sanctions have stopped the trend of appeasement by creating a firm response. First, sanctions make expansionist military adventures financially prohibitive. Paul Richter of the LA Times reports in September 2014, U.S. and European sanctions have damaged the Russian economy, triggering capital flight inflation and the beginning of a recession, leading to a 1% decrease in GDP. The IMF predicts that prolonged sanctions could reduce GDP another 9%. As a result, Andrew Duff of the European Parliament finds Moscow cannot afford a long military campaign. When Putin's generals asking for more money, he will have to say no. Indeed, Putin announced last May an 8% real reduction in planned spending on the military. Second, sanctions prevent the sourcing of necessary military equipment. Business Insider reports June 2015, sanctions include a ban on the sale of military technology to Russia. Russia will find it hard to replace Western military know-how because they've been relying on Western systems, which Russia doesn't make. This is important because The Economist reports in May 2014, without modernization, Russia's conventional forces will be almost useless, based on the Soviet model, top-heavy with officers and dependent on miserable conscripts stuck in crumbling barracks. The combined effects of sanctions have been profound. In Ukraine, The Guardian reported in November that support of pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine has plummeted as the Kremlin is pressing the militants to put the conflict on ice and promised to cut all support if offensives were launched. This has reduced hostilities as tanks have been pulled back from the front lines and ceasefire violations are becoming less severe. Nina Khrushcheva of the World Policy Institute explains in August that Western sanctions imposed following Putin's annexation of Crimea are the main factor limiting the pro-Russian rebels' incursion in eastern Ukraine. Contention 2, global stability. The West has built 21st century world order on more than just blood and iron. The world order rests on the idea that there should be certain international norms every country should follow, and great powers should act as the stewards of a more peaceful and stable world. Russia's recent actions violate these principles. David Kramer of the Washington Post reports in 1994, the U.S., Ukraine, Russia, and Britain signed the Budapest Memorandum as part of a deal for Ukraine to relinquish its nuclear weapons. Under that agreement, signatories are to respect Ukrainian independence and sovereignty within its borders, protect Ukraine from aggression, and avoid economic pressure on Ukraine. Clearly, Russia has violated that understanding. The U.S. and Britain have an obligation to respond, and other NATO allies should too. Kingston Reeve, director of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, explains, failing to respond to Russia's blatant violation of international law would send a dangerous signal that states that reject nuclear weapons or give them up as Ukraine did in return for security assurances can't count on outside assistance or support in the face of aggression. North Korea and Pakistan will be less likely to give up their nuclear programs, and states like Japan and South Korea, whose security Western nations guarantee with documents similar to the Budapest Memorandum, may decide to develop atomic weapons. For that reason, Reeve finds U.S. and EU sanctions are necessary to support Ukraine, punish Russia, deter future acts of aggression against other allies and partners, and uphold the credibility of security assurances as a non-proliferation tool. Protect Ukraine, protect the world. Vote pro.
We're going to take a brief bit of prep.
Okay, I have a second. Is everyone ready? Okay, let's begin. Meaning it resolved, on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat that Russia poses to Western interests. Our sole contention is that economic sanctions exacerbate international conflict. This happens for three main reasons. First, they increase nationalism. Nikolai Pakhanov of Russian International Affairs Council reports that when faced with an external threat, Russian nationalism goes into hyperdrive. Putin's rankings remain above 80% in national polls. Gretchen Jacobson of Penn State University explains that this nationalism leads to countries perceiving others as more expansionist or threatening, significantly increasing the probability of interstate war. Second, Russia's perceived weakness. According to Clifford Gaddy of the Brookings Institute, Russia believes that sanctions are designed to weaken it and reduce its ability to defend itself. Russia's perceived weakness leads to an increased threat, as Bettina Renz of the University of Nottingham writes, that Russia is more likely to engage in aggressive and preemptive military action to create that element of surprise that it can overcome its weaknesses. Third, Putin's need to show legitimacy. Jerson Pexton of East Carolina University explains that when an external actor demands a policy change from another regime, the targeted leadership perceives the foreign pressure as a threat to sovereignty. CNN writes that Russia feels that the West is allegedly pursuing an undeclared war on it. Although threatened by enemies, Russia will recover the Soviet Union status of being feared and therefore respected again. These motivations are evident in Russia's rising military spending. Richard Conley of the University of Birmingham explains that sanctions have caused the regime to reallocate resources to sectors that support the system, like military. Vladimir Ischenkov of the Business Insider reports that hundreds of new Russian aircraft, tanks, and missiles are being made. The military budget rose by 33%. For all these reasons, David Lutzkian of the American Foreign Policy Journal concludes that empirically the effect of sanctions on a crisis doubles the probability of conflict. This conflict has manifested in three ways. First, in Ukraine, Russia has attacked in two ways. First, sanctions have incentivized physical military action. Adam Nathan of The Independent quantifies an additional 50,000 Russian troops have been sent inside Ukraine. As of December 22nd, the Institute for the Study of War reported that Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine launched attacks against government forces, taking control of a village outside the strategic city of Mariupol. Second, through cyber attacks. Jen Edon of NATO finds that Moscow's strategy in Ukraine relies on cyber operations, which have contributed to their advantages in Kiev. Corey Bennett of The Hill finds that there were 10,000 Russian cyber attacks in 2015 on international targets, a rise from the dozens per month last year as the U.S. was imposing sanctions. Hugo Spalding of the Institute for War writes that as of 3 days ago, Russia inflicted a major blackout in western Ukraine in a cyber attack which demonstrates their capability amid the conflict over Crimea. Ukraine is really important, as Richard Kramer from the Foreign Policy Research Institute writes, that Ukraine provides an important buffer zone between Russia and Europe. Robin Fulton of Truthout explains that buffer states keep armies apart and allow for important regional countries to trade in peace. Second, in Syria, Richard Nephew of Columbia explains that Russian adventures in Syria are an attempt to demonstrate a sense of power to the outside world. According to The Economist in September, Russia is able to accommodate 1,000 to 2,000 troops in their Syrian bases. As of December 22nd, the Institute for the Study of War reported Russia conducted airstrikes on the rebel-held city of Idlib in Syria, inflicting 200 civilian casualties. Russia is helping Assad in Syria, going against the West. Matthew Bodner of Moscow Times explains that after a collaboration to fight ISIS with the West, Russia began intervening in Syria in September, helping Assad not defeating ISIS. Problematically, Hellier of The National writes that Assad is a greater threat than ISIS because his policies make it far more likely that ISIS and other terrorists will continue. Third, in the Arctic, Tom Porter in the International Business Times finds that Putin's new Arctic doctrine comes amid deteriorating relations due to sanctions, placing 80,000 troops in the region. Heather Conley of the Institute for International Strategic Studies furthers that Moscow has announced the reopening of 50 Soviet-era military bases in the Arctic. This region is important to the West, as Alaska Governor Sean Parnell explains. The ability to develop the American Arctic's vast natural resources is critical for the protection of strategic national infrastructure and assets. Thank you.
So let's just talk about the most recent thing you just said. So you're saying that the U.S. needs to develop in the Arctic. Why have sanctions prevented them from doing so?
Because what we tell you is that Russia has a greater presence in the Arctic. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in another conflict, so that's why it prevents.
So where is the largest deposit of oil in the Arctic?
I'm not sure.
In Alaska. So what's preventing the U.S. from drilling in Alaska?
So the U.S. could be drilling in Alaska. But the
Right.
thing is that there's other parts of the Arctic that are really important.
Right.
What that
Okay.
means, and that's
Yeah.
really important,
Okay.
because the U.S. is no longer going to have access to those other really important parts.
Okay.
In turn,
Right.
Russia's going to get access and
Okay.
gain more power.
Okay, I have a question though about that.
Yeah.
Your impact to decreasing U.S. leadership is coming from the U.S. not having the most control over the Arctic. But as so far as the most Arctic resources are in U.S. land, how does this impact materialize?
What we tell you is that they need everything they can get to weaken Russia, right? If Russia takes control of the rest of the Arctic, that's going to pose a threat. But could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. So historically, for example, are you familiar with the Battle of Stalingrad?
Sort of.
Okay, yeah. So during World War II, essentially what happened is that the Germans surrounded the city of Stalingrad. So
Okay.
what did the Russians do?
They burned everything.
The Russians, like,
Yeah, I don't
in
understand.
response to the foreign pressure, they were starved, they didn't have any food, they would rather eat their shoes than curb to foreign pressure.
Okay,
Are these the same kind of people that would
wait.
be able to, that are just going to curb to
Wait.
Western
Let's talk
sanctions?
about Stalingrad.
Okay.
They realized they were too weak to do anything, so they burned the city to the ground and retreated. So this is the exact
they
same
won that
situation. No, I don't think they did.
Well,
I still don't really understand the point because I was still in World War II.
Yeah,
This is
the
a
point is
completely different
that the
situation.
Russian people are a lot different than Americans, right?
Wait,
They
why?
respond a
So
lot
you-
differently to foreign pressure. It might seem logical that like people from other countries would
Okay.
respond to like sanctions, but the Russian people simply aren't the kind of people that would do that.
I just have a question about that.
Yeah.
As much as Russia wants to be aggressive, isn't their ability to be aggressive contingent upon their economic stability?
Okay, first, remember that Russia can just reallocate their budget to like favor the thing that they want. That's what they're doing right
Right.
now. We've seen that
Right.
sectors have been cut by 10% while their military has been increasing by 30%.
Okay, let's talk about the military spending
Yeah.
real quickly. When was that 33% increase in military spending from? When was that card from?
After sanctions were put in place.
So that was February. And then in March, they revised that because the sanctions were taking their toll and they decreased that planned military spending by 8%. In the affirmative world, there's more of an economic burden, so the increase in military spending is lower than it would have been in the con world.
The thing is that you have to remember is that like Russia's going to do what Russia wants to do. Russia wants to gain as
Okay.
much land as it
If Russia doesn't have a strong enough military,
Maybe
it doesn't matter what
might,
they want to
wait,
do.
it may not
That's
seem
fine.
rational to us, but that's what they have.
Okay, we'll run some prep time. Thank you. Okay, let's get for prep time. All right. Is everybody ready? To analyze the effect of sanctions on Russian aggression, we have to look at the world of the pro and the world of the con. In the world of the pro, we have sanctions, we're deterring further Russian aggression, and in the world of the con, we're doing nothing. We're letting Putin take Crimea, we're letting Putin take further action. With that in mind, look at our opponent's first contention about increasing international conflict, and they first talk about increased nationalism because of sanctions. The first problem here is that this increased nationalism isn't because of sanctions, rather it's because of Russian aggression that's been going on for a while. According to the International Business Times, Russian aggression has been a long trend. It started in 2008 with Russia intervening in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, and in 2014 in Crimea. That's when Putin's approval rating went up to 80%, not when sanctions were actually put in place. But second, when you isolate the effects of sanctions, they're actually decreasing Putin's popular support. Voice of America News reported on Wednesday that if the economy continues to drag, Putin's high poll numbers are going to go down. When people can't afford food, when they can't afford basic supplies, they're not going to be thinking that their leader is a good leader. Then our opponents second talk about the perceived threat of war and how Russia thinks that sanctions mean that the West is going to war with them. The first problem here is that our argument is a prerequisite. At the point when we demonstrate in our first contention that sanctions are eliminating Russia's capacity to act in these wars, it only spends 1/17 what the West spends on military spending. It's not able to. Even if it really hates the West, it can't operate a military operations in the West. But the second problem is that doing nothing is going to be a lot worse. Professor Robert Souza of the University of Poland explains that Ukraine is a test ground for Putin. If he intervenes in Ukraine and doesn't see a strong Western response, then he's going to continue to intervene. However, Michael Oslin at the American Enterprise Institute explains that when sanctions are put in place, even if they're just a token measure of response, it shows Putin that the West is going to respond. They're willing to fight for their interests, and they're not going to let him take whatever he wants. At that point, in the long term, you're going to reduce the amount of land that he can take. And then in their third point, they talk about how Putin needs to show his legitimacy. First, realize that again, he's playing a weak hand. Michael Oslin of the American Enterprise Institute furthers that because Russia's military spending is just 1/17 that of the West, Putin is playing a weak hand, and when the West responds, he's going to back down, because otherwise he just loses in this conflict. But the second problem with our opponent's argument is that when they talk about this increase in spending, as Eileen talks about, that was actually reduced afterwards in March. Remember this evidence from our case about how Putin announced in April that there's an 8% real reduction in military spending. This is really important because our opponent's evidence doesn't take into account inflation, which is 11% in Russia. However, ours does. Russian military spending is actually going down because of these sanctions. Then looking at my opponent's impacts, they first talk about Ukraine and how there's supposedly an increase in military operations in Ukraine. The first problem with this is that this isn't explained by sanctions, but rather by increased NATO action. Teresa Rivers of Barron's reported 3 weeks ago that on December 2nd, NATO extended a membership invitation to Montenegro. And Russia, according to Professor Charles Kupchan of Georgetown University, Russia sees NATO as an existential threat, and that's why it's increasing its military operations. At that point, none of their impacts are actually unique to sanctions, and it would have happened regardless. But the second problem with our opponent's argument is that now Russia can't actually act in Ukraine because it can't afford it. Daniel McCormick of the University of Pennsylvania finds that Russia no longer has enough military spending to actually be able to hold land in Ukraine. At that point, in the calm world without sanctions, we see that Russia would have actually gone into Ukraine, he would have been able to take it, whereas in the pro world, he's not actually able to take land, he has to rely on these cyber attacks and things that aren't as bad. But third, we see that casualties are actually down in Ukraine. The situation is improving. According to the UN, 55% fewer civilian casualties are happening now. Second, they talk about Syria. First, they don't prove the link to sanctions because that this is happening. Rather, the reason why Putin's intervening in Ukraine is that Syria is a strong ally of Russia. It's their only ally in the Middle East, and that's why he's intervening. They never say why sanctions are the case. Then third, they talk about the Arctic, but realize, according to CNN, that the largest oil reserves in the Arctic are actually in Russia. At that point, the United States doesn't need to act in Russia. We can just drill our own Arctic oil. Second, and more importantly, we see that that's actually going to be preferable if we're drilling our own oil in Alaska, because we see that there aren't going to be the problems associated with Russian oil and importing that oil back. So for all these reasons, we urge a pro ballot.
Yeah, we're just going to take a brief bit of that. Everyone ready? Start off with the first contention about EU stability. Remember that they talk about how Russia's not going to stop in Crimea, but that's not actually the case. What Reuters explains, she said Russia only wanted Crimea because of its access to deep-sea ports. It wasn't a political standing. But the reason they went into Ukraine is to use this political leverage. So when sanctions happen, they could say, oh, we're backing out of Ukraine, and the West would stop. But they got to keep their prize, Crimea. That's really important because that non-unites their entire argument. It's not because of sanctions that Russia's leaving, but because its mission is accomplished. It got the leverage in Ukraine, it got Crimea, and now it's going to back down. That's exactly what Trennan from Al Jazeera says, is that they don't actually want Ukraine, they wanted to stop NATO expansion, which is why they went into Ukraine, and now they're backing out because that NATO expansion isn't there. But then they talk about these financial burdens that are placed. Remember that Putin isn't a rational actor. When these economic sanctions happened, he cut 10% in every single budget except for military, which he increased by 33%. My opponents are going to get up here and tell you that it decreased by 8%. The 33 minus 8% is still 25% more of a military strength that Russia has now. In addition to that, you can cross-apply our case where you tell you that right now, in 2015, 50,000 troops went into Ukraine. That's increased aggression right there. But then they talk about how there's going to be a decreased economy. Remember that this isn't particularly because of sanctions. First, remember that Trennan tells you that this is because of the falling oil prices, not because of Russian sanctions, that the economy is going down. But second, their IMF card about 9% is in the long term, in the short, medium term. It's predicting this. You don't actually see this happen in the real world. You can't see that. But then, you can actually turn this argument against him, because what Benedict of the New York Times tells you is that Putin relies on his power by having either economic or military strength. When he loses the economic strength, it means that he has to amplify his military strength and his nationalism. You're going to see an increase in nationalism right there. But then they talk about how they can't afford it. Remember what Susan Austin explains, is that the military is an increasing part of the GDP. That means that Russia's prioritizing the military and wanting to be aggressive. Then they talk about how it's going to be, Russia needs to modernize, but what Giles explains to you is that there's a 2015 study that explains that Russia can still attack the satellite states, it still has the power and the military standing, sanctions aren't going to cripple the world's #2 military in an overnight, don't let them try to make that claim. But then they talk about how there's going to be these ceasefire violations. This is really, really important because their whole second contention talks about the importance of international law. But what Coppola from Reuters explains is that those Russian violations bring us closer to war and undermine international law. That's a direct term because when they have these agreements that Russia isn't actually upholding, overall you see international law is weakened and now there's no precedent in the future. We're waiting off of their impact. But then remember that this has never happened in the past. That's what Nossel from the Pan American Institute explains, is that Russia historically has never backed down. It's not going to now. The Russian people that Alyssa tell you that would rather eat their shoes than lose to the Germans are not going to back down just because of economic sanctions trying to weaken them. But then we go into their second contention. Remember that Russia was not deterred. What we actually see is that more other countries were born. But remember, you can turn this Budapest Memorandum they talk about because what Gabas tells you is that it's not actually a political reason. What you see is that it was just to protect. First of all, Ukraine wasn't in the NATO, so Russia didn't actually violate this, but it's more political than a legal binding. It wasn't even legitimate international law anyways. This argument isn't there. But remember the turn that I made, that when you see more ceasefire violations of the Minsk agreement, you actually see international law decline in strength. That's really important because these sort of laws that protect the country's security, like my own opponents talk about, are going to lose legitimacy as soon as sanctions are in place, and they're going to not be followed. But then they impact us to Korea and how Pakistan are more likely to use a nuclear war. Remember that Pakistan and North Korea are the last countries on the planet who are ever going to follow international law. This honestly isn't really a decrease. Like, honestly, did we think North Korea was going to listen to the UN anyways? Ready for pause?
Of course. Okay, so everybody ready? So you mentioned that ceasefire violations are really bad, but then you never respond to the Guardian analysis that's finding that because of sanctions, ceasefire violations are going down. So doesn't that just turn all of your arguments?
No, here's the thing. What you actually see is we prove to you that remember that you don't respond to the fact that Russia honestly doesn't want Ukraine. It doesn't care at all.
Okay, so let's talk about the facts on the ground instead of just theory. At the point when in November there were fewer ceasefire violations than there were before, isn't that an improvement?
Here, let me tell you why there are less ceasefire violations.
Okay.
The reason is because Russia never actually wanted Ukraine. Russia just wanted Crimea because it had access to deep sea ports, which needed power in the Middle East.
So then why were they operating in Ukraine before? Why were there a ton of ceasefire violations
That's
before?
exactly what's happening. So first, they wanted Crimea, right? They go into Ukraine. This is what Putin has concocted, right? They go into Ukraine and they use their army in Ukraine as leverage. So then the West says, okay, we're going to implement sanctions, and Russia says, okay, we'll back out of Ukraine. Sure, they backed out of Ukraine, but ultimately they got the prize they wanted, Crimea. That's why they're in Ukraine before, that's why they're leaving now, not because of sanctions.
But at the point when we're showing you that it's still working, we don't really know, we can't be inside of Putin's head. We're not absolutely sure what he's doing.
But
at the point when we're showing you concrete progress on the ground, let me finish explaining. I actually let you talk for about 30 seconds. At the point where we're not only seeing this progress in Ukraine, but also in the Balkans, also in the Baltic, and all these other satellite states, it's not just this one nation of Ukraine, but it's a trend of decreasing aggression. Isn't that showing that Putin's becoming less aggressive because of sanctions?
First of all, you never actually showed me that, one, Putin was going into the Baltic.
Well, that's actually what we do. The evidence that you don't respond to.
Okay, can you, first of all, the Baltic was never under threat under Putin, right?
Well, no, it definitely was. There were increasing airspace violations after he took over Crimea.
Okay, there were increased airspace violations. That means
right, he's also trying to foment revolution.
Wait. Whoa, he's trying to get a revolution in Europe?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really?
Right, in these Eastern European nations, he's trying to take them. They were in his former sphere of influence. He's trying to get
a gigantic revolution in the Eastern Europe.
That's exactly what he did in Eastern Ukraine.
Totally gonna become Russian now.
That's exactly what he did in Eastern Ukraine. He created instability so that he had the pretext for invasion.
Okay. So can you?
That's what he did in Crimea. That's not absurd. Now can I ask you another question?
Can you just give me
evidencing that Putin wanted to have a huge Eastern European revolution, throw out all the governments, put himself in power?
That's okay. You're trying to make my argument sound absurd, but this is what's already happened. This is what Russia has already done in these nations, like Moldova. Can you explain to me what happened in Moldova in 1993?
No.
Okay, so what happened there was that Russia actually created ethnic conflict between two groups, so that there was actually a separatist nation created that's a Russian satellite state now. This isn't something absurd, this is what Russia's been doing for years.
Okay, why does this apply to the East Baltic where there are no actual Russian states?
What?
Where the Russian satellite
The Baltics have a large Russian population.
Okay, so you're saying that Putin's gonna go in and try to make all these states for himself now?
Yeah, he just took Crimea, he's trying to take these other nations. This is what you don't respond to in our case, from Brown and Brzezinski finding that Putin has an expansionist agenda. This is what he's trying to do.
Okay.
We'll run a little bit of prep time.
Okay, so now.
Alright, that's good.
The most important thing to recognize in today's round is what Lofton tells you at the top of his rebuttal, that in analyzing the effects of sanctions on Russia's threat to Western interests, we have to look at a world with sanctions and a world without. At that point, two ways to vote pro. The first is our first contention about European stability. Both Brown and Brzezinski tells you that Russia has an expansionist agenda. That's why in 1993 they messed around in Moldova, why in Georgia in 2008, and then again in Crimea in 2014. Now my opponents try to tell you that they only want the strategic resources, but then it wouldn't make sense for them to be trying to get more territory, as they tell you themselves in their Ukraine impact. So far as that's true, we need sanctions to stop this threat, and this happens because we're reducing the GDP of Russia. According to Richter, these sanctions have already decreased the GDP by 1%, which they don't respond to. This is specifically because of the sanctions, not the oil that they try to tell you in their response. Now, the impact is reducing aggression. We've seen this already, and that's what's happening empirically on the ground. The Guardian tells you that we're decreasing support for rebel forces. We're pulling back tanks from the border, and there are fewer ceasefire violations. My opponents try to tell you that in their case, that Russia perceives more of a threat and they're going to try to expand militarily, but empirically that hasn't been the case. Remember the 8% real cut in planned spending. My opponents try to tell you that there's the military spending is increasing right now, but first of all, when you control for inflation, it isn't, but second of all, it's lower now than it would have been in the con world. So the increase in spending is better off in the pro world than the con world. The second way you can vote pro in today's round is our second contention of global stability. Remember that this Budapest Memorandum is a legitimate international security assurance. When Russia violates the Budapest Memorandum without repercussions, it shows nations like Japan and South Korea, which they don't respond to, that these security assurances aren't legitimate, decreasing global stability through non-proliferation. This is the biggest impact because it's international. Now, my opponent tried to tell you that these Ukraine interventions is because of the sanctions, but it's because of NATO action, not the sanctions themselves. And when they talk about Syria, they're going to intervene regardless because of Assad.
We'll run some prep now.
Okay, so just to provide a roadmap, I'm going to start with framework, their side of the flow, our side of the flow. Okay, let's begin. So first, on framework, my opponents tell you that sanctions are the only way to deter Russia in the future. But first, remember that Russia is now not going to agree to anything because they perceive the West as trying to act against them. At that point, they're not going to sit down to the negotiating table as when they see that the West is acting against them. Let's go to my opponent's side of the flow, what they don't respond to. First, they don't respond to the fact that the military spending is an increasing part of their GDP. At that point, you're going to see that they're have the capability to go into these other regions. You see that 50,000 troops are going into Ukraine. But then my opponents say then my opponents try and tell us that we're in a double bind here. But remember, that's simply not true, right? They're going in to protect Crimea, which is what they want. They may be pulling out of other areas that are irrelevant to them, but they're keeping Crimea, which is super important to them. But next, on my opponent's contention to what they don't respond to. First, the countries that they talk about, like North Korea, we're never going to follow international law in the first place. That's simply absurd. But next, remember that the Minsk, which is an international agreement now, is being violated every single day. That in itself is going to devaluate international law. But let's go to our side of the flow. First, on our first contention. My opponents try and tell you that the long-term trend is going to be a decrease. But remember, we tell you specifically because of sanctions, there's going to be an increase. They tell you in March that they were pulling out. But we tell you in 2015, in September, they added 50,000 troops in Ukraine. This is really important because when we talk about Ukraine, they try and tell you that it's not due to sanctions, but they don't tell you why else they would be putting more troops in Ukraine. But what they don't respond to is cyber attacks, and this is super important. They're going to win Ukraine because of cyber attacks. Sanctions specifically tell Russia that they are going to use these cyber attacks because they want to retaliate against the West. They use these cyber attacks, they're going to win Ukraine. That is no longer a buffer state. But next on Syria, my opponents try and tell you that they're going to go in anyways because they are allies with Assad. But then, we tell you specifically that because of sanctions, Putin wants to show his strength, thus he's going into Ukraine, or going into Syria, helping Assad, hurting the West by not helping ISIS. Assad is a bigger threat than ISIS because he is what makes ISIS strong. His leadership fosters terrorism groups. For all these reasons, you can feel comfortable negating. Thank you.
Alright, is everybody ready?
Yes.
Yeah. So isn't increased Russian aggression the past couple months that you talk about because of NATO expansion, not because of sanctions?
No. Here's the thing. First of all, we're actually seeing that NATO military budgets are decreasing.
No, you're not responding to what we talk about in rebuttal that's essential, which is that NATO offered membership to Montenegro.
Okay, where's Montenegro?
It's right next to Russia.
Okay, so the country of Montenegro now with NATO is going to basically bring them.
So you never responded to the analysis that I made in rebuttal, which is essential to understand how Russia thinks. Russia perceives the West, and especially NATO, as this existential threat because of what happened during the Cold War. So when NATO increases its expansion to nations that are inside of its sphere of influence, it gets really scared and it lashes out and attacks.
Wait,
so that's what the aggression.
You mentioned that because you delinked your own argument about Ukraine.
No.
Wait, can you let me finish? Okay, you just said that the only reason Russia feels threatened is when NATO comes. So when NATO came into Ukraine, that's why Russia attacked. When NATO left, that's why they're backing out.
Okay, let's just make something really clear. So everything you go for in your case in summary, the cyber operations, increased physical aggression, and Syria is because of the perceived threat of the West, right? So which one would be a bigger perceived threat? NATO militarizing and getting Montenegro into the NATO coalition, or these economic sanctions?
Wait, that doesn't make sense. What we're telling you is that because of sanctions, there's 3 distinct reasons why that Russia wanted to do these attacks.
We understand. So what we're saying is that, sure, there might be a little bit of a perceived threat from sanctions, but the majority of it is because of NATO action. So how do we delineate the impacts of increasing aggression in Ukraine and Syria from sanctions or NATO action?
Okay, well, first of all, the fact that Russia is increasing their aggression in Ukraine as NATO is decreasing their military budgets proves that the threat of sanctions. Will you let me finish?
Yeah.
Proves that the threat of sanctions is so great to Russia that they want to lash back.
Okay, so you're ignoring the meat of the debate. What NATO's spending on their military doesn't really matter considering they're already spending 17 times Russia's military budget. What does matter is when NATO actually starts making moves, when they make moves in Russian territory. That's what's provoking the Russian backlash, not sanctions.
Wait, the thing is, Russia knows that the NATO budget is going down, so maybe they're making these attacks. They obviously
It's not
can't
going down
last
17 times. Like, NATO's spending is going to be higher than Russia's for all of the foreseeable future, right?
Yeah, but you see, okay, first of all, like, you see that there's one, like, the fact that it's decreasing doesn't, even if the budget's bigger, signals, right, that NATO isn't interested in attacking Russia.
Right, but that's completely reversed at the point where they offer membership to neighboring countries.
And
Okay.
militarizing the Baltic Sea.
Okay, here's the thing though, right? The Russia like doesn't, okay, first of all, like militarizing in the Baltic Sea by NATO like doesn't necessarily make Russia think that like NATO is coming.
Wait, if sanctions do, then militarization doesn't?
Okay, can you just clarify?
Right, so our argument is that the reason for militarization and the impact you go for are not because of sanctions, it's predominantly because of the NATO militarization. Unless you separate those two, you can't win this round.
So we'll use the rest of our prep time if you could just let me know when it's up.
23 seconds.
Alright, is everybody ready? Remember that when you're deciding whether or not you should vote pro or con in today's round, you need to look at both worlds, the world with sanctions and the world without sanctions. Realize that in the world without sanctions, all the negative harms they talk about are still going to happen. Russia's going to be lashing out against the West. There are going to still all be these harms in Ukraine because of what we talk about that they never actually make a substantive response to. NATO in recent months has been increasing its operations. It offered membership to Montenegro. They never responded to this. This is the reason why there are those 50,000 troops. This is the reason why there are those cyber attacks on Ukraine, not the sanctions. They never proved that link. However, what we see is changing in the pro world is that we're creating a deterrent. We're saying that when Russia does actually intervene in these NATO nations and surrounding nations like Ukraine, we're going to fight back. The Western result is there. Remember, they never respond to the evidence that I read in rebuttal, talking about that if we do nothing according to Oslan, then Putin's just going to expand. Ukraine is the test case, and if we don't fight back and just let him have Crimea, he's going to keep expanding. That's the first reason why you should vote pro, but the second reason is what we talked about in our first contention, that he's going to keep going. Remember, according to Brown, he has this expansion agenda that history has proven. However, sanctions are solving that by hurting the Russian economy. They never respond to the fact that there's been a 1% decrease in Russian GDP, which in turn makes spending less in the pro world. Sure, spending is increasing in both worlds, but it's increasing less in the pro world, which decreases their military capabilities. So when we isolate the effects of sanctions, we see progress. They never respond to the Guardian evidence, which finds that because of sanctions, Putin has stopped supporting the rebels in Ukraine. There are fewer ceasefire violations that they say are so bad, and there's decreased support and decreased civilian casualties. At that point, we're seeing a better pro world with fewer deaths and improved Russian interest. The third reason why you should vote pro is our second contention about global stability. Remember, we made a promise to Ukraine that Russia broke. We have to punish Russia for breaking that promise, otherwise nations like South Korea and Japan, not these rogue nations, are going to acquire nuclear weapons, which is going to knock the global balance out of order. That's not something we want. We don't want a world with nuclear weapons that everybody has. So because we see that the pro world is comparatively better to the con world, we urge a pro ballot.
Alright, I'll be going on to framework, our case. Sounds good? Let's begin.
Remember that my opponents talk about how when we do nothing in Russia, it pursues expansionism. But what a listen I show you is that Russia wasn't going to expand beyond Ukraine because the only reason it was is because of the NATO influence. Now that they got rid of that, they're pulling back. That's really important because we show you that sanctions perpetuate Russian aggressionism. But even if you don't take that, remember that Russia was going to come onto the table before sanctions. Now they're not. There are no agreements. That's really important because there's less cooperation overall. Go on to our first contention about increasing Russian aggression. My opponents try to de-link this by saying that it's because of NATO. But remember that NATO expansionism was before sanctions. We didn't see this Russian military increase before sanctions. So that's proving that when they actually had these sanctions in place, the only change factor led to a Russian military increase of 33%. They concede in final focus that the Russian military spending is going up far more than it would have when there were sanctions, that's the biggest impact because now Russia's going to attack into all these places, violate borders, and create more international conflict. But then they talk about, and on their side of the flow, they talk about how Russia has an expansionist agenda, but they've gotten rid of that. Remember that they keep on going for this economy card, but Putin doesn't work that way. That's why he decreased military spending in all sectors except for the military in 33%. And then they talk about how there's going to be less troops overall, but they never respond to our analysis in 2015. 50,000 troops are in Ukraine right now because of Russian expansionism. That's the biggest impact. But then, let's talk about Syria. Remember that they tried to delink this by saying that it's because Putin was an ally of Assad. But we show you that directly. First, before sanctions, Putin wasn't willing to help Assad. Once sanctions came, Putin wanted to project power. He went in, he helped us. He started helping Assad, and as of December 22nd, he started giving airstrikes on rebel cities. That's really important because now we're the only side that show you that there's expansionism not in the Ukrainian front, but as well as the Syria front. We're impacting to expansionism across the globe. They can only tell you Ukraine, you can vote neg right there. Here,